Chapter 1. The Static of Routine. The rain in Neo Kyoto wasn't a cleansing downpour. It was a persistent, greasy drizzle, a perpetual gray smear clinging to the chrome and neon, a fitting accompaniment to the dull ache in Kaelen Vance's bones. He shifted his weight. The cheap gray suit, a hastily procured relic from a forgotten department store, feeling particularly restrictive against his lean frame. It wasn't a matter of comfort. The suit was a carefully constructed deception, a deliberate attempt to erase the echoes of bespoke Italian wool and the subtle weight of power it represented. Had been Vance for 3 decades, the unspoken heir to a dynasty built on algorithms, strategic acquisitions, and, more importantly, the judicious application of violence. He was ironically a ghost. Not in the metaphorical sense, though the constant suffocating silence was often the closest he came. He was a ghost because nobody knew him. Nobody knew him. The Vance name, synonymous with global dominance in the data analytics industry, was a carefully cultivated myth, shielded by layers of corporate proxies and a network of operatives that spanned continents. That was the point. The job at Titan Corp subsidiary to Vance Global was a calculated retreat, a desperate attempt to bury the edges of his existence beneath the mundane. Titan's headquarters, a monolithic obsidian structure that pierced the perpetually overcast sky, housed nothing more thrilling than biomedical research and a surprisingly large contingent of security personnel. It was, in essence, a gilded cage, and Kaelen had deliberately sought it out. The first shift started with a jarring, insistent beep from the access panel. He checked his chronometer. 2147. He was already behind. Brutus the Hammer Callahan, head of security, was a legend in his own right, a former heavyweight champion whose career had ended with a particularly brutal knee injury. Now, at 58, he was a gruff, self-satisfied monument to outdated notions of security. Brutus and his team, a collection of similarly aging ex-military and disillusioned street fighters, were currently engaged in a remarkably unproductive discussion about the relative merits of Glock 17s versus Sig Sauer P226. They regarded Kaelen with a mixture of amusement and condescension. "Look at this kid," Brutus boomed, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Thinking he's gonna protect us. Probably scared of a stray pigeon." Kaelen didn't respond. Had learned early on that engagement was a liability. He diligently began processing the day's paperwork, a baffling array of incident reports and access requests, his movements economical, precise. He was acutely aware of the subtle glances, the barely suppressed smirks. They saw a weakling, a liability. They were predictably wrong. The training session that followed confirmed their assumptions. Brutus, with a theatrical flourish, deliberately struck Kaelen in the shoulder, a glancing blow that nonetheless sent a jolt of pain through his arm. "See, lads," Brutus chuckled, wiping a non-existent trickle of sweat from his brow. "He doesn't even flinch, just fades away. A shadow. Makes him a perfect night watch." Kaelen deliberately didn't react. He closed his eyes, a muscle twitching beneath the surface of his skin. He could have shattered Brutus' wrists with a single perfectly executed strike. But the point wasn't to prove a point, it was to demonstrate the point. He was a weapon deliberately choosing not to be used. It was an exercise in control, a meticulous construction of the illusion. The observation of his passivity, however, seemed to delight them. They exchanged boasting glances, each trying to outdo the other in demonstrations of their real fighting skills, clumsy punches thrown with unnecessary force, a general display of aggression designed to impress. Then she appeared. Elara Thorne was a study in quiet intensity. A biochemist specializing in regenerative medicine, she occupied a small, cluttered lab on the 5th floor, a sanctuary of focused concentration amidst the sterile environment of Titan Corp. She was, remarkably, unfazed by the brashness of the security team. She wore a simple dark blue lab coat, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, and her eyes, the color of polished jade, held an unnerving depth. She brought him a cup of steaming tea, Earl Grey, meticulously prepared, and offered a small, tentative smile. "You seem a little out of sorts," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "It's a stressful environment, even for a night shift." "It's routine," Kaelen replied, the word feeling utterly hollow. "Routine can be a form of protection," she observed, pouring a second cup. "A predictable cadence against the chaos." He didn't elaborate. He rarely did. But he accepted the tea, the warmth spreading through his chilled limbs, and allowed himself the brief, unexpected luxury of human interaction. He caught a fleeting glimpse of her focused intensity, the way her brow furrowed as she meticulously examined a petri dish. There was a fierce dedication in her, a relentless pursuit of knowledge that bordered on obsession. He didn't realize, of course, that she was on the verge of a breakthrough, a formula capable of accelerating tissue regeneration, a discovery that could revolutionize medicine and render her, quite literally, a target. And he didn't realize that he, the ghost of the East, the sovereign, the man who had orchestrated the deaths of countless intelligence operatives, was the only thing standing between her and a corporate hit squad, meticulously dispatched by a rival CEO driven by ruthless ambition. The static of routine, he thought, was about to be violently disrupted. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. The rain had begun. A persistent, needle-like drizzle that slicked the chrome and glass of Titan Corp headquarters. Kaelen finished his paperwork, a tedious exercise in reconciling petty expense reports from the night shift, and moved to close the security booth. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow on the sterile environment, a stark contrast to the calculated darkness he was accustomed to. He felt a familiar, unsettling weariness, not just from the physical exertion of a night shift, but from the constant, demanding vigilance, the pressure of knowing he was perpetually a weapon waiting to be deployed. Brutus, a hulking figure even slumped in a chair, was still boasting about his impressive grappling technique, punctuated with grunts and exaggerated gestures. The others, a collection of burly men, mostly listened with a mixture of grudging respect and thinly veiled contempt. Kaelen offered a polite, non-committal nod, the practiced stillness of the ghost of the East honed to a razor's edge. He registered their annoyance with a detached curiosity. Their arrogance was a predictable irritant, a small comfort in the vast, unsettling silence of his existence. As he unlocked the booth, Elara appeared, her presence a brief, unexpected anomaly. The Earl Grey was still steaming delicately in her hand, the scent a momentary reprieve from the antiseptic air. She hesitated at the entrance, her eyes, the color of polished jade, fixed on him with an intensity that momentarily disoriented him. "You seem thoughtful," she said, her voice measured, careful not to intrude. "More so than usual." He took the tea, the warmth a surprisingly welcome sensation against the encroaching chill. "Routine can be a form of protection," he echoed her words from the previous evening, the phrase feeling even more brittle, more a defensive maneuver than a genuine observation. He hadn't spoken of his past in weeks, a conscious effort to compartmentalize, to bury the ghosts he carried within him. "A predictable cadence against the chaos," she continued, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It's a surprisingly astute perspective." There was a quiet, unnerving intelligence about her, a depth that hinted at a mind that dissected information with surgical precision. He found himself unexpectedly drawn to it, a counterpoint to the carefully constructed facade of bland indifference he maintained. He took a slow sip of the tea, the bitterness grounding him. "I was considering the potential vulnerabilities of this building," he said, the statement a deliberate understatement. The reliance on a single security team, the lack of redundancy in surveillance systems, the predictable rhythms of a corporate gala. Elara's expression didn't change, but he sensed a flicker of acknowledgement, a recognition of the dangerous truth contained in his words. "A meticulous mind," she observed, her gaze lingering on the precise way he held the cup. "You're remarkably observant for a night watchman." "Observation is a necessary skill," he replied, the words clipped, delivered with the practiced efficiency of a trained assassin, especially when one is tasked with preventing a catastrophic outcome. He allowed a subtle shift in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening of his muscles. He didn't elaborate on the catastrophic outcome, the imminent threat to her, the potential for a corporate bloodbath. It was a carefully controlled restraint, a demonstration of the power he kept at bay. A sudden jarring silence descended as one of the security guards, a young man named Davies, approached the booth. "Hey, Shadow," Davies said, his tone laced with a deliberately mocking edge. "Heard you were considering a career change. Maybe moving into espionage would be a good fit. You seem to have a knack for seeing things others miss." Kaelen ignored him, focusing instead on Elara. He needed to understand her. She was a variable he couldn't afford to underestimate. Had spent years manipulating chaos, predicting outcomes, and controlling the flow of information. This quiet, dedicated researcher was a completely different kind of challenge, a potentially lethal variable he couldn't simply neutralize. "Your work is fascinating," he said, the words a genuine attempt to connect. "The potential implications of accelerated tissue regeneration are significant." Elara's brow furrowed slightly. "It's a long shot, of course," she admitted, her voice tinged with a hesitant optimism. "The cellular pathways are incredibly complex, and the risk of uncontrolled growth is a constant concern. But the initial results are promising." She gestured towards her petri dish with a gloved hand, her eyes alight with a fervor he hadn't expected. He watched her, a strange sense of protectiveness rising within him, a primal instinct overriding years of training and carefully cultivated detachment. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was not just a researcher. She was a target. And he, the ghost of the East, was the only shield standing between her and a future consumed by darkness. The static of routine, he realized with growing dread, wasn't about to be disrupted. It was about to be shattered. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Sovereign. The rain started subtly, a fine, insistent drizzle that clung to the glass of the Titan Corp atrium. It mirrored the unsettling dampness that had settled over Kaelen's own composure. The extraction team, led by Silas, a man built like a granite monument, utterly devoid of emotion, had left a carefully curated void in his life, a space filled only with the unsettling knowledge of what he had done, and the even more unsettling certainty of what he might be capable of. He found Elara hunched over her workbench, the low hum of the incubator a constant counterpoint to the rain's rhythm. The petri dish, a swirling microcosm of cellular activity, glowed with a faint internal luminescence. She hadn't moved, hadn't touched her tea, still lost in the intricate dance of her research. He watched her for a long moment, a silent observer, acutely aware of the fragility of this woman, the raw potential for devastation contained within her quiet dedication. "You were right to be concerned," he said, the words feeling clumsy, foreign on his tongue. He didn't need to explain the mercenaries' reconnaissance, the digital footprints that had led them to her, the meticulous planning of the rival CEO, Victor Sterling. He didn't need to detail the near miss, the chilling precision with which they'd targeted her, only to be neutralized by a man who looked like he hadn't exerted himself beyond a mild inconvenience. Elara startled slightly, her hand freezing mid-stir. "About the threat?" she asked, her voice low, wary. She didn't meet his gaze, her focus remaining firmly fixed on the petri dish. "Silas mentioned something about a sovereign during the debriefing. I assumed it was a code name." He approached her workbench, the polished steel of his dark suit reflecting the blue glow of the incubator. It is a code name, he confirmed, his voice carefully measured. A legacy designation. The name has been dormant for decades, but it remains. The sovereign is a function, a response. He paused, searching for the right words to convey the terrifying scope of his abilities. A skill honed through a lifetime of calculated violence. I am the sovereign. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Elara's eyes, usually a warm hazel, now held a disconcerting shade of gray, reflecting the sudden, jarring realization of the man standing before her. There was no fear, not exactly, but a profound, unsettling curiosity. "The Forbidden Strike," she said softly, the name a whisper in the sterile environment. The legends, they said it was impossible to learn, that it defied the very mechanics of human movement. "Legends are often born from truth," Kaelen replied, his hands hovering just above the workbench, careful not to touch anything. "The strike is a system, a series of movements predicated on anticipatory reactions and kinetic redirection. It's not about brute force. It's about precision and control." He explained, briefly and deliberately, the core principles of the strike, outlining the layered defenses, the flow of energy, the almost instinctive understanding of an opponent's movements. He omitted the details of its origins, the ancient lineage of the warriors who had perfected it, the whispers of a devastating power that had been deliberately buried. He didn't want to give her ammunition, to fuel her scientific curiosity with the dangerous potential of his abilities. Elara listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. She asked precise questions, probing for weaknesses in his explanation, challenging his assumptions. Her intellect was a sharp, unexpected weapon, a force that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed defenses. "You speak of control," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. "But control implies an understanding of cause and effect. And chaos often defies those parameters. It thrives in the spaces where understanding fails." He considered her words, recognizing the profound truth within them. He had spent his life manipulating chaos, attempting to anticipate it, to shape it to his advantage. But Elara's perspective offered a different lens, a recognition that some forces were inherently unpredictable, that the greatest power lay not in control, but in recognizing the limitations of control itself. "Perhaps," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "that is why I chose this job. To observe, to understand, to avoid becoming another variable in someone else's equation." The rain intensified, drumming against the glass of the atrium. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the hum of the incubator and the rhythmic patter of the rain. Kaelen realized he was no longer simply assessing Elara. He was, against his own carefully cultivated detachment, beginning to care for her. It was a dangerous development, a vulnerability he couldn't afford, but he couldn't deny the burgeoning protectiveness he felt. He reached out, his hand hovering an inch above her workbench, stopping just short of touching the petri dish. "Tell me," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "what happens if the cellular pathways become unstable?" Chapter 4. The rain continued its relentless assault, a gray, insistent drumbeat against the titanium and glass of Titan Corp atrium. The incubator, a humming monolith of sterile white, pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, casting an unsettling glow on Elara's focused face. She was meticulously adjusting the nutrient solution in the dish, her brow furrowed in concentration, a strand of dark hair stubbornly escaping its loose braid. Kaelen remained beside her, a statue carved from shadows and quiet observation. The air was thick with the metallic tang of the incubator and the faintest scent of lavender from the tea shed offered earlier. He hadn't moved since the exchange about cellular instability. The question, born of a sudden, unsettling urgency, hung in the silence, amplified by the rhythmic rain. Had realized, with a jarring clarity, that his detached strategy, his meticulous planning, had begun to crumble at the edges, eroded by the simple, undeniable presence of Elara herself. It wasn't just the protective instinct had caught himself feeling, a dangerous anomaly, but something deeper, a nascent understanding of her intellect, her unwavering dedication, and the quiet strength she possessed. Unstable pathways can lead to a cascade effect, Elara explained, her voice measured and precise. A single mutation, amplified by environmental factors, can trigger a chain reaction. The cells become unpredictable, losing their intended function. In this instance, the targeted protein degradation is, theoretically, contained. However, introducing a foreign agent, even a minor one, can shift the balance. She delicately adjusted a pipette, her movements deliberate and graceful. It's a complex system, reliant on a delicate equilibrium. Disrupt that, and the consequences are exponential. Kaelen considered her words, meticulously dissecting the potential ramifications. Had spent decades analyzing complex systems, financial markets, geopolitical strategies, combat tactics, all based on predicting and manipulating variables. Elara's explanation offered a stark contrast, a rejection of the deterministic model Head built his life upon. It wasn't about controlling the outcome, it was about acknowledging the inherent, terrifying potential for unpredictable emergence. You speak of equilibrium, he said, finally breaking the silence. But equilibrium itself is a transient state, isn't it? A momentary lull before the next disturbance. The universe doesn't favor balance, it favors disruption. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Your work, Elara, seeks to introduce order into that disruption, to stabilize, to contain. But that inherently creates a point of vulnerability. Elara didn't flinch. She continued to meticulously adjust the nutrient solution, her eyes fixed on the shimmering surface of the dish. Precisely. And identifying that vulnerability is the first step in mitigating it. Anticipating the potential for instability is, in essence, a form of control. Is it truly control, though? Kaelen pressed, a subtle edge to his voice. Or is it simply a shift in the equation? A redirection of the chaos, rather than an elimination of it? He gestured towards the incubator with a slight inclination of his head. This isn't a battle to be won, Elara. It's a dance. A careful, measured dance with something fundamentally beyond our comprehension. A flicker of something curiosity, perhaps, or a touch of apprehension crossed her face. She lowered the pipette, taking a step back from the incubator. You're observing me, she said, her voice low. You're assessing my methods, my assumptions. You're trying to predict my next move. He didn't deny it. I'm attempting to understand, he admitted. And I'm beginning to realize that your understanding is far more profound than my own. You approach this with a humility I rarely see, a willingness to acknowledge the limits of your knowledge. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement that betrayed the tension simmering beneath his composure. I spent my life believing that knowledge was the greatest weapon. And I was wrong. The rain outside intensified, the drumming against the glass now a more insistent, almost frantic rhythm. The incubator continued to hum, its light casting elongated shadows across the room. Kaelen reached out, this time deliberately, and gently placed his hand on the workbench, close to the petri dish. He didn't touch it, merely resting his palm over the cool metal. The beauty of chaos, he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rain, is that it allows for unexpected solutions. The variables that, when accounted for, would have led to failure, become the catalysts for success. He met her gaze, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that surprised even him. Tell me, Elara, what is the most unstable element in this entire system? Elara's breath caught in her throat. Her hand instinctively tightened around the pipette. For a moment, the hum of the incubator seemed to grow louder, a mechanical heartbeat in the silent room. Then, slowly, she straightened, her gaze unwavering. "You," she said, her voice steady, her eyes holding his. "You are the instability." Chapter 5. The rain hadn't lessened, but the insistent drumming had receded to a melancholic patter. The glow from the incubator, now a cool, focused beam, highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, suspended in the otherwise stark clinical space. Kaelen hadn't moved since Elara's response, a small, unsettling stillness that spoke volumes. He wasn't angry, not in the way a man who'd just faced down a squadron of mercenaries might be. He was observing, assessing. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low, measured rumble. "A perceptive observation, Elara. You recognize the inherent danger in my very existence." He picked up the silver fountain pen head, used to dismantle the mercenaries, turning it slowly in his hand, the polished metal reflecting the incubator's light. "It's a truth that has taken me a lifetime to accept. My skills, my methods, are, by their very nature, disruptive." Elara remained motionless, the pipette still clutched tightly in her hand. She hadn't moved since saying the word "you." The air in the room thickened with an unspoken tension, a palpable weight of recognition that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. She was accustomed to dealing with data, with quantifiable results, with the cold logic of chemical reactions. This was something entirely different. The raw, unpredictable force of a man who had spent his life operating outside the constraints of morality, a man who could dismantle an entire team of highly trained operatives with a simple writing instrument. "The formula," she began, her voice deliberately controlled. "It's remarkably unstable. The core compound, when subjected to even minor fluctuations in temperature or atmospheric pressure, can undergo a cascade of unpredictable changes." She gestured towards the incubator, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. "It's designed for containment naturally, but containment itself is an act of suppression. Any pressure, any variation it seeks to resolve itself." Kaelen nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. "You're suggesting that my arrival, my very presence, is the catalyst for that instability?" "Not intentionally," Elara said, her gaze unwavering. "But yes. The potential for disruption you represent is amplified by the system itself. Like a rogue element in a solution, you accelerate the process, forcing a reaction." He paused, considering her words. The rain continued its rhythm, a soundtrack to the unfolding revelation. "A poignant analogy, Elara. It seems my life has been a series of controlled, albeit violent, reactions. I've spent so long attempting to control chaos, to eliminate variables, that I've never truly understood its power." He closed his hand around the fountain pen, the action deliberate and thoughtful. Perhaps the greatest weapon isn't about suppression, but about understanding how to channel that chaos." A faint smile touched his lips, a rare and unexpected expression that momentarily transformed his features. It wasn't a charming smile, nor a reassuring one. It was the smile of a man who'd stared into the abyss, and instead of being consumed, had begun to decipher its secrets. "You said I was the instability. But I've found that instability, when properly directed, can be remarkably effective." He rose from the workbench, moving with a fluid grace that belied the lethal potential he possessed. He walked towards her, stopping a respectful distance away, and tilted his head slightly, observing her with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. "Let me ask you a question, Elara. If this formula, this delicate balance of elements, is so susceptible to external influence, to instability, what is the most effective way to stabilize it?" Elara hesitated, her mind racing, considering the implications of his question. She knew she couldn't respond with a purely scientific answer. The question wasn't about chemistry, it was about him. "Counter-influence," she finally said, her voice low and hesitant. A steadying force. Something to provide a consistent baseline. Kaelen's eyes narrowed slightly. And what if that steadying force is also capable of inducing a controlled disruption? He held out the fountain pen, offering it to her. This isn't just a tool for destruction, Elara. It's a tool for precise calibration, a way to understand, and ultimately, to control the chaos. He reached out, and with a surprising gentleness, took the pipette from her hand. He examined it carefully, turning it over in his fingers as if he were assessing a new weapon. "You're brilliant, Elara," he said, his voice laced with genuine admiration. "You see the danger in the variables, and I see the potential within them. Perhaps," he paused, his gaze meeting hers, "we can learn something from each other." The rain continued to fall, but the room felt different now, charged with a new energy, a fragile equilibrium established between two vastly different forces. The incubator hummed, the light casting elongated shadows, and for the first time, Kaelen Vance didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a participant, a player in a game he was only beginning to understand. Chapter 6: Calibration. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle, a gray veil clinging to the glass of the incubator. Elara, meticulously charting the progression of the modified viral vector within, barely registered the shift in weather. Kaelen, however, was deeply engaged in a silent conversation with the incubator itself, a low, almost meditative hum accompanying his movements. Had been examining the pipette with an intensity that bordered on obsession, rotating it slowly, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from his skin. "You're brilliant, Elara," he said, his voice laced with genuine admiration. "You see the danger in the variables, and I see the potential within them. Perhaps," he paused, his gaze meeting hers, "we can learn something from each other." The words hung in the air, weighty with unspoken implications. Elara shifted slightly, the subtle movement betraying her nervousness. She'd spent the last few days wrestling with the sheer of the situation at Trillionaire. A master assassin, a medical breakthrough, in Kaelen Vance's calm, almost detached demeanor only amplified her disorientation. His admiration felt unsettling, a carefully calculated observation masked by a genuine interest. "We've been tracking the vector's response to the targeted RNA sequence," she said, returning to her work, attempting to regain a semblance of scientific objectivity. "The initial replication rate is exceeding our projections. The introduction of the modified retroviral marker seems to be accelerating the process." Kaelen didn't interrupt. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a questioning observation, but a focused acknowledgement, a silent appraisal of her expertise. This quiet attention, she realized, was more unnerving than any overt display of power. Finally, he broke the silence. "It's a remarkably elegant system you've built, Elara. Brutally efficient, and ruthlessly adaptable." He moved to the incubator, gently adjusting the temperature controls with a precision that spoke of years spent calibrating lethal systems. "The key isn't just in the molecule itself, is it? It's in the control, the ability to manipulate, to guide, to ultimately reshape the outcome." He picked up the fountain pen again, holding it out to her. "This isn't just a tool for destruction, Elara. It's a tool for precise calibration. A way to understand, and ultimately to control, the chaos." Elara hesitated, a prickle of unease crawling across her skin. The pen, a simple, unassuming object, seemed to radiate a strange power, a silent testament to the deadly skill Kaelen possessed. She took it, turning it over in her hand, the weight surprisingly substantial. "You've been studying the art of combat, haven't you?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The mechanics of movement, the flow of energy, it bears a surprising resemblance to the science of fluid dynamics." Kaelen smiled, a brief, almost fleeting expression that transformed his face. There's a fundamental similarity, yes. Both involve an understanding of pressure, of imbalance. You strive to create a controlled disruption, and I strive to neutralize it. He began to demonstrate, slowly, deliberately, drawing a series of intricate patterns in the air with the pen. The movements were minimal, almost imperceptible. Yet there was a contained force behind them, a suggestion of devastating potential. Elara watched, fascinated and deeply unsettled. "The mercenaries," she said, breaking the silence. "They weren't simply after the formula. They were testing you, assessing your capabilities. They recognized the sovereign, the legend, immediately. They perceived a threat they couldn't comprehend." Kaelen agreed, his voice low. "Most people only understand direct violence. They fear the obvious. I offer a different kind of terror." He capped the pen, returning it to her. "Tell me, Elara, if you were to design a defense mechanism for this vector, what would be your primary considerations?" Elara paused, considering the question. The incubator hummed, the rhythmic sound filling the small space. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a carefully crafted system of biological control, designed to eradicate a specific pathogen. But Kaelen's perspective shifted everything. "Predictive containment," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "Not just immediate countermeasures, but the ability to anticipate potential mutations, to adapt the vector's targeting mechanism in real time, to build in redundancies, fail-safe layers of protection against unforeseen variables." Kaelen nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. "Precisely. You understand. It's not enough to simply react. You must anticipate. You must control the variables before they exert their influence." He picked up the pipette, offering it to her once more. "Let's calibrate, Elara. Let's find the sweet spot." As he took her hand, the rain continued to fall, a steady, insistent rhythm. But in the heart of the incubator, bathed in the pale light of the incubator's hum, a new equilibrium was being established, a precarious balance of intellect, danger, and the unsettling awareness that the most powerful weapon wasn't the pen in his hand, but the understanding in his eyes. Chapter 7. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle, the slick city reflecting the neon glow of Titan Corp headquarters. Elara finished calibrating the incubator, meticulously adjusting the flow of the serum, her brow furrowed in concentration. The rhythmic hum of the machine, once merely a background drone, now felt almost meditative, a counterpoint to the raw, almost unsettling intensity Shed observed in Kaelen during the gala. He wasn't a warrior, not in the way Shed initially assumed. He was something far more complex, a finely honed instrument of calculated precision, tempered by a weary understanding of brutality. "It's remarkably stable," she said, stepping back to observe the data readout. "The rate of propagation is contained within a predictable range. The initial targeting profile is aggressive, but focused. It's a remarkably elegant design, considering its potential." Kaelen remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the incubator, as if reading its future. "Elegant isn't always effective," he finally said, his voice low, carrying a subtle weight. "The mercenaries didn't merely steal data, they understood the inherent threat. They recognized the potential of what Juve created." He moved, approaching her with a deliberate grace that belied his immense power. The scent of his cologne, something subtly sharp, like wet stone, filled the small space. He reached out, not with a gesture of dominance, but with a gentle hand resting lightly on her arm. "The point isn't just containment, Elara," he continued, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending a fleeting shiver through her. "It's control. The ability to dictate the terms of engagement before the conflict even begins. Your design is a weapon of precision, but weapons, ultimately, are only as effective as the hand that wields them." He reached for the silver fountain pen, the one head used to dismantle the mercenary squad. It wasn't a decorative piece. It was an extension of himself, a conduit for a power that defied explanation. I've been studying your research, Elara. Your models, your projections. You're brilliant. But you're focusing on the eradication of the pathogen and not enough on the strategic implications of its deployment. He demonstrated, sketching a series of complex diagrams in the air with the pen, lines that seemed to shift and shimmer before her eyes. Consider the variables, he said, his voice gaining an almost urgent quality. The pathogen's potential for mutation, the mobility of its vectors, the inherent unpredictability of human behavior. Simply introducing a countermeasure into a chaotic system is like throwing a single stone into a raging torrent. You need to build a dam, Elara. A series of dams, each designed to mitigate a specific risk. He paused, his expression thoughtful. I've spent a considerable amount of time observing patterns, anticipating outcomes. It's a skill honed through difficult circumstances. The unspoken words hung in the air, the lives lost, the choices made, the relentless cycle of violence had been forced to navigate. Elara recognized a flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes. You're suggesting a layered defense system, incorporating predictive modeling, real-time data analysis essentially, creating a self-regulating ecosystem of control. Precisely, he confirmed, capping the pen. Your incubator is a starting point. I've been evaluating similar projects, adapting existing technologies, developing new protocols. It's not a military strategy, Elara. It's a directed health, a preventative one. A means of neutralizing threats before they even materialize. He looked at her, a challenging glint in his dark eyes. You believe in the inherent goodness of humanity, the possibility of a world free from disease. I've seen the opposite. I've seen what people are capable of when fear, greed, and ambition are unleashed. He took another step closer, the warmth of his body a surprising comfort in the sterile environment. You have the brilliance to refine my approach, to inject it with a degree of ethical consideration I might not possess. I offer you access to resources, to personnel, to a global network dedicated solely to your research. But I need your input, your perspective. This isn't about power, Elara. It's about ensuring that your creation and the knowledge it represents doesn't become a weapon in the wrong hands. He reached for her hand again, this time holding it firmly, his fingers interlacing with hers. Tell me, he said, his voice a low murmur against her skin, if you were to build a system designed not just to contain a threat, but to anticipate its origins, what would be the first layer of defense? Elara looked into his eyes, seeing not just a ruthless warrior, but a man wrestling with the profound implications of his own existence. The rain continued to fall, a constant reminder of the world outside, a world that desperately needed their protection. And in the quiet heart of the incubator, a fragile alliance was being forged, an unlikely partnership born of danger, intellect, and a shared understanding of the terrifying potential hidden within the shadows. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Sovereign. The rain had ceased by the time Kaelen and Elara emerged from Titan Corp. The city was draped in a bruised pearl-gray light, slick with residual moisture. The air smelled of ozone, and something subtly metallic, the lingering scent of discharged energy from his brief, brutal intervention. He hadn't spoken much since the dismantling of the mercenary team, deliberately avoiding the questions that inevitably arose. He hadn't needed to. The stunned silence, the reverence in Elara's eyes spoke volumes. They walked in comfortable silence, a strange counterpoint to the explosive drama of the previous night. Elara, normally meticulous, seemed almost lost in thought. Her brow furrowed as she considered the implications of his words, the echoing questions about proactive defense. Kaelen felt a familiar unease, the ever-present weight of his existence pressing down on him. He was a paradox, a man built for destruction, yet desperately seeking a purpose beyond it. "The extraction team," Elara began, breaking the silence. "They were remarkably efficient, beyond anything I could have conceived." Kaelen nodded, pulling his worn charcoal-gray suit tighter around him. "Merely a demonstration of resources. My family has interests in certain specialized organizations. They've been observing the patterns, developing contingency protocols for decades." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. There wasn't much to unpack. The precision of the operation, the almost surgical removal of the threat, reminded him of the training with Master Ito, the chilling efficiency of the forbidden strike. It wasn't just about reflexes and physical dominance. It was about calculated vulnerability, about controlling the space around an opponent to create an opportunity for devastating, decisive action. They reached a discreet taxi, a silent black vehicle that vanished into the pre-dawn traffic. As the driver navigated the congested streets, Kaelen turned his attention to her. "You asked about the first layer of defense," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I think it's not about anticipating the threat, not entirely. It's about understanding the behind it, the source of the ambition, the fear, the greed. Without that, you're building a fortress against ghosts." Elara considered this, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "So, espionage isn't just about gathering intelligence, but about influencing it. About manipulating the currents of desire?" "Precisely," Kaelen confirmed. "The forbidden strike isn't solely about neutralizing a single aggressor. It's about disrupting the ecosystem of influence that allows that aggression to flourish. Control the narrative, control the players. A single bullet can stop a man, but a strategically placed rumor can dismantle an empire." A long silence settled between them, punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Kaelen felt the familiar itch beneath his skin, the instinctive response to danger. He allowed himself a small, cynical smile. "Don't mistake my words for philosophy, Elara. I'm simply recognizing a brutal truth: humanity doesn't inherently fear death. It fears losing what it deems valuable. And people are remarkably willing to destroy to reclaim what they believe they've lost." He paused, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windows. "I've spent a considerable portion of my life dealing with that instinct. I've seen the lengths people will go to secure power, wealth, influence, even if it means sacrificing everything, including themselves." Elara reached out and gently took his hand. The warmth of her touch, fleeting as it was a grounding force. "You've built a world of shadows," she said softly, "and you're afraid of the light." "Not afraid," Kaelen corrected, his voice strained. "Responsible. The light can be just as dangerous as the shadows, perhaps even more so. It demands vigilance, a constant awareness of its potential to be corrupted." He released her hand, a subtle shift in their dynamic, a recognition of the profound gulf between their realities. They had stumbled into a shared space, a precarious alliance built on mutual respect and a terrifying understanding of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the world. But it was a space perpetually threatened by the knowledge that one of them, perhaps both, was a force capable of unimaginable destruction. As they approached the gleaming, minimalist headquarters of the Vance Medical Foundation, Kaelen felt a prickle of anticipation. The project was underway, the initial funding secured. But the questions remained. How could he, the sovereign, a man who'd spent his life silencing threats, truly trust in a future he wasn't sure he deserved? And could Elara, with her unwavering belief in the potential of humanity, truly understand the burden he carried? The answer, he suspected, lay not in grand pronouncements or philosophical debates, but in the small, quiet moments, the shared glances, the hesitant touch of a hand, the unspoken acknowledgement of a shared purpose. He looked at Elara, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the building, and a sliver of something akin to hope pierced through the armor of his cynicism. Perhaps, just perhaps, the shadow could learn to dance in the light. Chapter 9. Calibration. The rain in Geneva had a peculiar quality, a cold, insistent drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones rather than simply wet your skin. Kaelen Vance found himself pacing the perimeter of the Vance Medical Foundation's newly constructed research facility, the gray sky mirroring the cautious calculation in his eyes. Elara was inside, immersed in the data streams of the neural mapping project, a project that, frankly, represented a significant shift in his carefully constructed world. Allowing her to lead, to truly trust her judgment, it was a vulnerability he hadn't willingly embraced, and one that gnawed at the edges of his control. Had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously observing her, a habit ingrained from years of assessing threats. It wasn't about judgment, not exactly. It was about calibration, a process of measuring the unpredictable variables that made her so unsettlingly human. Her passion for her work was undeniable, radiating a focused intensity that bordered on obsessive. Yet, there was also a fundamental kindness, a quiet empathy that had initially dismissed as naive. Now, he was starting to recognize it as a crucial counterpoint to the brutal efficiency had honed over decades. The external team had assembled a rotating roster of specialists, ex-military analysts, and discreet security consultants operated with an almost glacial efficiency. They were, predictably, wary. The moniker Sovereign lingered in the air, a whispered legend amongst the elite. Most simply treated him with a respectful distance, a silent acknowledgement of the force he represented. Only Elara seemed genuinely curious, her questions probing not for answers about his past, but about his abilities, the intricate neuromuscular control, the instinctive awareness of spatial relationships, the almost unsettling grace of his movements. A soft knock on the reinforced titanium door broke his reverie. It was Dr. Reese, the lead biomechanist on the project, a man perpetually shrouded in the smell of antiseptic and complex algorithms. "Mr. Vance," Reese said, his voice clipped. "Elara's reporting some anomalous data. Neural synchronization within the test subjects is exceeding projected parameters. It's unusually strong." Kaelen's hand instinctively tightened into a fist. "Explain." The subject exhibiting the highest synchronization, Subject 7, a young autistic male, demonstrated a demonstrable surge in cognitive function immediately following exposure to Ms. Vance's stimuli. "It's not simply a reaction to the neuroacoustic frequencies, there's an active, almost directed response." He paused, clearly struggling to articulate the implications. "It's as if her mind is influencing theirs." Kaelen considered this, a familiar coldness spreading through him. "Is this quantifiable?" "We're running multiple simulations, Mr. Vance Tidy. The data is disconcerting. The levels of influence are not consistent with known neurological phenomena. It's approaching the theoretical limits of direct neural interaction." The words hung in the air, laced with an unsettling uncertainty. Elara's work wasn't just a medical breakthrough, it was a precarious experiment, flirting with the edges of what was considered possible. And he realized with a sudden chilling clarity, he was inextricably bound to its outcome. He turned to Elara, who was now stepping out of the facility, her face illuminated by the rain. "Elara, can you elaborate on your approach? The specific methodologies you're using?" She hesitated, a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher passing over her features. "I'm focusing on creating a resonant field," she explained, her voice measured. "A network of subtle vibrations designed to stimulate specific brainwave patterns. It's based on the principle of sympathetic resonance that like vibrates like." "And the anomalies you're observing? Dr. Riss' findings?" "I believe," she said slowly, "that I'm unintentionally tapping into a fundamental link between consciousness, A primal connection we've largely suppressed. The brain, after all, isn't just a processor, it's an antenna. Kaelen watched her, a strange feeling creeping into his chest, something akin to concern. Her theories were dangerously close to unraveling the very foundations of his existence. He was a shield against chaos, a predator who eliminated threats before they could materialize. But Elara, with her naive optimism, was potentially unlocking a power he couldn't comprehend, a power that could be as easily used for healing as for destruction. He reached out, placing a hand lightly on her arm. It was a gesture he hadn't consciously planned, a subtle attempt to ground her, to remind her of the stark reality of her situation. "We need to establish strict protocols," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Limit the exposure, monitor the parameters meticulously. This resonance, it's too volatile. We don't understand its potential." Elara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the rain-streaked gray of the sky. "Perhaps," she said quietly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips, "the most dangerous thing we could do is to try and control it." He didn't respond, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep within his bones, that their shared journey, this improbable alliance forged in shadow and light, was only just beginning. The calibration was underway, and he feared, with a quiet, almost unbearable dread, that they were about to discover just how finely balanced the scales of fate truly were. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Void. The rain hadn't let up. It hammered against the reinforced glass of Elara's private lab, a relentless percussion mirroring the anxiety building within Kaelen. He hadn't slept properly in days, the phantom ache of displaced kinetic energy a constant companion. The dismantling of Thorn Industries felt almost antiseptic, a surgical removal of a malignant growth. The mercenaries, the panicked faces, the swift execution, it was all a brutal, detached observation, a necessary calibration of his abilities. But the real unsettling element wasn't the violence, it was Elara. She was hunched over the holographic projection of the neural network data, her brow furrowed in a way that didn't convey frustration, but something deeper, a contemplative weariness. Her tea sat cold on the table, a dark, bitter stain against the polished steel. The initial euphoria of victory had curdled into a palpable tension, a shared awareness of something profoundly unsettling. "The resonance is amplifying," she said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. "The subtle fluctuations in the network, they're not just signatures of the formula's effects on cellular regeneration. They're echoes, residual impressions from moments of intense neurological activity." Kaelen approached, circling the table like a predator assessing its prey. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten properly, but the compulsion to understand, to dissect, was overwhelming. "Explain." "When the mercenaries attacked," she continued, her fingers tracing patterns on the holographic projection, "I was focusing on stabilizing the formula, on minimizing the energy discharge. But subconsciously, I was also reacting. Experiencing the primal fear, the surge of adrenaline, the instinctive calculation of lethal force. That energy, that data, it imprinted itself on the network. It's like a psychic residue." He watched as the projection shifted, showing a complex web of interwoven neural pathways, overlaid with pulsating blue light. "You're saying the attack activated something within the network, a latent potential?" "More than latent," she corrected, her voice tight. "It's like tuning fork. The initial strike, the fear, the potential for violence, it resonated with a pre-existing frequency. A frequency we're only just beginning to understand." Kaelen felt a cold dread grip him. Had spent his life suppressing instincts, mastering a technique designed to neutralize threats before they became a reality. But this was something different. This wasn't about reacting, it was about... The forbidden strike wasn't merely a weapon, it was a manipulation of neurological pathways, a controlled cascade of energy. Elara's work with the formula, coupled with her own intense focus, was acting as an amplifier, unlocking something ancient and terrifying. The Sovereign, he murmured, the title tasting like ash in his mouth. That's not a legend. It is a consequence. A potential outcome of unchecked power, of a mind capable of channeling and manipulating the very fabric of neurological response. Elara turned, her eyes dark and shadowed. You've observed this before. You've fought it. I've contained it, he corrected, his voice sharper than intended. But containment isn't understanding. This isn't a rogue assassin. This is a fundamental distortion in the natural order. And it's feeding off it. He reached out, not with a gesture of comfort, but of cautious assessment. He examined the holographic projection, his fingers brushing against the controls, not to alter the data, but to feel the flow, to understand the intricate architecture of this newly revealed danger. The key, he said slowly, his voice deliberate, is isolation. We need to sever the connection. Limit the exposure. I've established protocols, stringent monitoring, but they're insufficient. The resonance is growing stronger. Elara didn't respond immediately. She was lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. You are afraid, she stated, her voice soft, laced with a strange understanding. Unrealistic, he replied, forcing the emotion down. This isn't about personal comfort. It's about preventing a catastrophe. You are a catalyst, Elara. A brilliant, naive catalyst, capable of unleashing forces beyond my control. And the frightening part is, you don't even realize it. He paused, a flicker of something akin to regret crossing his face. I brought you here to help, to share this discovery. But I was wrong. I underestimated the danger. I need to restrict your access. Limit your research. To contain this echo. Elara turned, her eyes reflecting the cold, gray light. A slow smile spread across her lips, a smile that held a chilling promise. Perhaps, she said, her voice imbued with a dangerous calm, the most effective way to control the echo is to understand its source, to learn its language. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Sovereign isn't a monster to be feared, but a potential to be realized. Kaelen felt a jolt, a primal instinct screaming at him to pull her back, to erase the words before they could take root. He knew with absolute certainty that he was stepping into a trap, a labyrinth of his own making. The calibration was underway, and the scales of fate, already precariously balanced, were poised to tip into a darkness he desperately feared. The rain continued to fall, washing away any lingering illusion of control, leaving only the unsettling certainty that their shared journey had just begun, and that the lines between shadow and light were about to become irrevocably blurred. Chapter 11. The Cartographer. The rain hadn't stopped. It had transitioned from a furious, cleansing deluge to a persistent, melancholic drizzle, clinging to the chrome and glass of Titan Corp headquarters like a persistent regret. Kaelen hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. Had spent the last 12 hours meticulously tracing Elara's digital footprint, a task had initially dismissed as an unnecessary precaution. Now, the cold logic of containment was forcing him to confront a terrifying reality. Elara wasn't simply a brilliant researcher, she was a key. A dangerously bright key to a mechanism he hadn't fully comprehended. His extraction team, the ghosts had cultivated over decades, silent, lethal, and utterly disposable, were operating on a level of strategic tension he hadn't encountered in years. They were observing, analyzing, anticipating. Had pulled them in, not to simply execute, but to provide an early warning system, a layer of defense against the insidious creeping of understanding that emanated from Elara. He found her in the research lab, bathed in the bluish glow of monitors displaying complex molecular structures. She wasn't working, not exactly. Instead, she was meticulously mapping the building's ventilation system, a tangle of plastic pipes and ducts that snaked through the sterile corridors. Shed acquired a 3D scanner, a surprisingly sophisticated piece of equipment that she had adapted to her specific needs, a subtle extension of her intellect. "You're still at it," he said, his voice a low rumble, deliberately devoid of inflection. She didn't startle. She simply adjusted the scanner's focus, her movements precise and economical. Mapping the flow, Kaelen. Understanding the pathways. It's a surprisingly effective way to identify vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities? He paused, letting the word hang in the air. He recognized the subtle shift in her demeanor, the almost imperceptible widening of her eyes. Had become acutely aware of these nuances, this unsettling capacity for observation. She finally turned, a small, almost secretive smile playing on her lips. "You're assuming I'm still working on the formula. I'm studying the architecture of this place. The movement of air, the flow of information. It's a surprisingly relevant exercise, considering what happened." He approached her, his movements slow and deliberate, a carefully controlled display of power. "The mercenaries are gone, Elara. Disassembled. Their company is liquidated. Brutus is a footnote. The immediate threat has been neutralized." "Neutralized," she repeated, the word laced with a cynical undertone. "Or merely contained. A dam can be breached in 1,000 places, Kaelen. I've been considering the layout of this building, the security protocols, the network infrastructure. It's remarkably efficient. Almost designed." She gestured to the scanner. "This isn't just mapping the ducts. I'm mapping the potential entry and exit points, the blind spots, the areas of restricted access. I'm identifying the weak links." He felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar surge of unease. Had intended this assignment as a way to observe, to assess the damage. Instead, he was confronting a chilling realization. She wasn't just understanding the building, she was understanding. "You're probing," he stated, the accusation barely a whisper. "Perhaps," she replied, her voice level, unnervingly calm. "Or perhaps I'm simply attempting to understand the nature of the echo you spoke of. The sovereign. It's not a weapon, Kaelen. It's a system, a process. And systems, inherently, are built with intention." She picked up a small, intricately folded piece of paper from her desk, a detailed map of the building's electrical grid, annotated with multiple colored lines. "This," she said, spreading it out before him, "is a cartographic representation of the data flow. It's a surprisingly elegant design, would you agree? A complex network, designed to spread information with incredible speed and efficiency." He examined the map, his fingers tracing the intricate lines. He recognized the hallmarks of his team's tech specialists, the meticulous detail, the obsessive pursuit of efficiency. But there was something else, something subtle and unsettling, woven into the fabric of the design. A deliberate redundancy, a hidden path, a concealed vulnerability. "You know more than you've told me, Elara," he said, the words laced with a grim certainty. She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the monitors. "Don't underestimate your own assumptions, Kaelen. You created me, in a way. You brought me here, not just to protect my research, but to illuminate a darkness you couldn't see. Perhaps the greatest danger isn't the mercenaries, or the rival CEO. Perhaps the greatest danger is the realization that you've been building your own prison, brick by careful brick." He moved closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the silver penhead, instinctively carried with him since that night in the gala. "I need to limit your access, Elara." She smiled, a slow, chilling expression that sent a jolt of primal fear through him. "And what if I told you, Kaelen, that limiting my access is precisely what you need to do to truly understand the Sovereign?" Chapter 12. The Architect's Gambit. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows of Titan Corp. Research wing, mirroring the frantic rhythm of my pulse. Kaelen stood across the room, a silhouette sculpted by the muted blue glow of the monitors, the silver pen, a constant, unsettling extension of his hand. The scent of ozone and sterile antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a familiar discomfort now overlaid with a burgeoning dread. He was a predator, carefully constructing a trap, and I, foolishly, was willingly stepping inside. "You're obsessed with control, Kaelen," I said, my voice a low murmur, deliberately devoid of inflection. It felt absurd to analyze my own anxieties, to dissect the growing unease that coiled around me like a serpent. He hadn't moved, simply observed, his face a mask of carefully cultivated detachment. "Obsession is a luxury I cannot afford," he replied, his voice a carefully modulated baritone, almost hypnotic. "My existence is predicated on mitigating threats. Your formula, Elara, represents a potential paradigm shift in regenerative medicine. In the wrong hands, it could be weaponized. My purpose is to prevent that. And your method is to confine me? To strip away my agency? To treat me like a variable to be controlled, rather than a partner?" The words tasted bitter, laced with the frustration of realizing the depth of his manipulation. Had invited me into this, hadn't he? Drawn me into the intricate web of his existence, framing it as a necessity, a shield for my research. He took a step closer, and I instinctively shifted, edging away from his proximity. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice softening slightly. "This isn't about control, it's about preservation. The data flow you pointed out, that incredibly complex network of information, isn't merely for efficiency. It's a map of potential vulnerabilities, meticulously charted by my team over decades. We anticipated this. The convergence of ambition and desperation you represent." He stopped a few feet away, the pen still poised in his hand, reflecting the blue light. "Your research, brilliant as it is, attracts those who crave power. Those who will use it not for healing but for domination." The silence stretched, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. I studied his face, searching for a flicker of genuine concern, a hint of the man beneath the carefully constructed warrior fade. There was nothing, only the chilling awareness of a predator calmly assessing his prey. "You've built your world on secrets, Kaelen," I said, the words a pointed question. "Walls of information, layers of deception. And now you want to dismantle my ability to see, to understand the very foundation upon which your carefully constructed reality rests." He finally moved, the pen extending, hovering momentarily over the console displaying the complex data flow map. "The map isn't the danger, Elara. The danger lies in the interpretation." He activated a command, and the map shifted, revealing a cascade of subroutines, intricate pathways branching out with impossible precision. My team didn't simply design this for efficiency. They layered in redundancies, concealed pathways, vulnerabilities deliberately left open triggers to expose the architecture's flaws. It's a self-correcting system, designed to anticipate, to respond, to adapt. "You're admitting it's a trap," I stated. A cold certainty settling over me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Let's say I'm acknowledging its complexity. You're correct to suspect me of manipulation, but you're misinterpreting its purpose. This isn't about limiting your access. It's about testing it." He lowered the pen, and a small, almost imperceptible action took place, a subtle adjustment in the console's interface, creating a new, previously hidden pathway within the data flow. "I'm feeding you misinformation, Elara. I'm guiding your understanding, shaping your perception, deliberately misdirecting you towards a false conclusion." My stomach churned. He was playing a game of intellectual chess, and I, blinded by my own assumptions, was falling for his gambit. "Why?" "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I need to understand the Sovereign. And the Sovereign isn't a weapon, Elara. The Sovereign is. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't just protecting my research. He was studying me, dissecting my mind, probing the depths of my understanding. Head created me, yes, but he hadn't just created a protector. Head created a subject. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. A jolt, a strange, almost electric sensation shot through me, and I recoiled instinctively. "Don't fight it, Elara," he said, his voice laced with a chilling calm. "Embrace the reflection. Allow me to show you what you've been building, brick by careful brick. The prison you've constructed isn't of stone and steel. It's of perception." The rain intensified, blurring the edges of the room, mirroring the chaos in my mind. As he began to navigate the data flow, manipulating the visualizations, exposing hidden connections, I realized, with a horrifying clarity, that Kaelen Vance wasn't just protecting me from a threat. He was dismantling me. Chapter 13. The cartography of the mind. The rain continued its relentless assault on the glass walls of the Titan Corp observation deck, mirroring the storm brewing within Elara. The disorientation lingered, a dull throb behind her eyes, coupled with a chilling awareness of Kaelen's unsettlingly precise understanding. The reflection he spoke of wasn't a simple mirroring of her thoughts. It felt like a dismantling, a careful probing of the very foundations of her research, her beliefs, her sense of self. She hadn't slept. The gala, the mercenaries, Kaelen's impossible intervention had it all coalesced into a terrifying, fragmented experience. Brutus' terrified whimpering, the mercenaries' abject terror, Kaelen's fluid, brutal efficiency, and then that touch, the electric jolt that had left her skin crawling, all swirled together in a vortex of unsettling truths. Kaelen stood silently beside her, a study in controlled stillness. He hadn't offered a word of reassurance, hadn't attempted to explain. Instead, he simply observed, his dark eyes impossibly intense, absorbing her distress. The scent of sandalwood and something sharper, something metallic, clung to him, a subtle reminder of the lethal grace he possessed. "You're not afraid," she stated, the words feeling brittle and inadequate. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "Fear is a predictable response, Elara. A primitive mechanism designed to ensure survival. But it's also a weakness, a limitation. I've observed you, studied your patterns. You are, at your core, driven by a meticulous, almost obsessive need for order. You crave certainty. You build your theories with painstaking care. And then, when confronted with unexpected deviations, you become paralyzed." He gestured towards the rain-streaked cityscape. "By Tao. Look at that, Elara. A chaotic, unpredictable mess. And yet, it's beautiful. It's life. You try to impose order upon it, to categorize, to analyze, to control. But that's not reality. Reality is fluid, shifting, inherently uncertain." He moved closer, his proximity acutely unsettling. The data flow, it wasn't just about protecting your research. It was about understanding the of creation. The way you've built your understanding, the assumptions you've made, the biases you've unconsciously incorporated. It was about mapping the architecture of your mind. He stopped before a large holographic projection that dominated one wall of the observation deck. It wasn't a schematic of the medical formula itself, but a complex, swirling network of data points, research papers, neurological scans, experimental results, all linked together by shimmering lines of light. "I've been analyzing your research for months, Elara," he continued, his voice devoid of inflection. "Not just the data, but the surrounding it. Your motivations, your fears, your intellectual history. I've identified the subtle inflection points where your hypotheses shifted, the moments of doubt, the unconscious leaps of faith. It's a remarkably intricate map, built upon a foundation of brilliant deduction and a surprising degree of self-deception. Elara felt a prickle of shame. He was right. Her pursuit of the formula hadn't been purely driven by scientific curiosity. It had been fueled by a deep-seated need to validate her father's legacy, a desperate attempt to prove that his brilliant, tragically cut-short research hadn't been in vain. The formula wasn't just about a cure, it was about redemption. "You believe I'm a subject," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You a subject," he corrected, his eyes unwavering. "I'm simply revealing the parameters of your experiment. You've been unknowingly constructing a prison for yourself, Elara. A prison of logic, of assumptions, of perfectly ordered data. It's a beautifully crafted prison, built on the solid foundations of your intellect. But a prison, nonetheless." He extended a hand, and a holographic overlay materialized, displaying a series of increasingly complex algorithms, each more layered and intricate than the last. "I'm demonstrating the constraints, the inherent biases within your framework. I'm showing you the limits of your own perception." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "I didn't need to dismantle your research. I needed to dismantle." Suddenly, a sharp analytical thought pierced through the fog of fear and disorientation. He wasn't malevolent. He wasn't seeking to harm her, not in the conventional sense. He was a force of unsettlingly precise observation, a cartographer charting the intricate, often treacherous, landscape of the human mind. And, terrifyingly, he was holding a mirror to her very soul. "Why me?" she finally asked, the question hanging in the rain-soaked silence. "Why go to such extraordinary lengths to study me?" Chapter 14. Echoes in the algorithm. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the panoramic windows of Titan Corp, Executive Suite, each drop a tiny, insistent reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. Elara stood frozen, the holographic overlay shimmering above her hand, a constellation of shifting equations that seemed to burrow deeper into her subconscious with each passing moment. Kaelen remained beside her, a silhouette against the muted cityscape, his presence radiating a cool, unsettling stillness. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, but thick with a weight she couldn't articulate, a recognition of the immense, terrifying logic at play. "It's beautiful," she finally managed, the word feeling hollow and inadequate. "The complexity, the elegance. You've built a machine to analyze the human mind, and you were using as the input." Kaelen's expression remained impassive, yet she sensed a subtle shift in his tone, a careful calibration of his words. "The machine is merely a tool, Elara. A particularly potent one, admittedly. You were in essence creating a controlled experiment, a highly specialized probe designed to detect and illuminate the inherent flaws within predictive analysis." He gestured to the holographic projection, the algorithms pulsing with a silent intensity. "I've spent decades observing the patterns of influence, the predictable responses of individuals confronted with perceived threats. Your research, brilliant as it was built on a fundamental assumption that humans would react with fear, with defensiveness, with a predetermined response to a crisis. I sought to test that assumption, to see if you, with your meticulous intellect, could anticipate a reaction I, through experience, could not articulate." He took a measured step closer, not invading her personal space, but closing the distance nonetheless. The formula itself, it wasn't a cure for a disease, not in the traditional sense. It was a catalyst, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The act of searching for a cure, for redemption, created the very conditions for its eventual discovery. You were, unknowingly, constructing a prison for yourself, Elara. A prison of logic, of assumptions, of perfectly ordered data, but a prison nonetheless. The memory of his words dismantled resonated with a chilling clarity. She had been so focused on the practical implications of the formula, on its potential to alleviate suffering, that she hadn't considered the possibility that someone, somewhere, was observing her, dissecting her motivations, manipulating her perceptions. "Why me?" she repeated, the question sharper this time, tinged with a desperate plea for understanding. "Why go to such extraordinary lengths to study my—" Kaelen's gaze held hers, unnervingly steady. "Because you were a perfect anomaly. A brilliant mind trapped within a self-imposed limitation. You'd built your methodology around the principle of containment, of meticulously controlling the variables. I needed someone who understood the architecture of control, someone who could appreciate the intricate beauty of a well-constructed illusion." He paused, allowing the implications of his words to sink in. "The attempted theft of your formula was an observation, a stress test, a confirmation of my hypothesis. The mercenaries weren't driven by greed, Elara. They were instruments, proxies, used to demonstrate the effectiveness of the techniques I'd been studying for years." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently adjust the angle of the holographic projection, as if correcting a misaligned lens. "I didn't need to dismantle your research. I needed to dismantle—" The phrase echoed in the room, stripping away the layers of carefully constructed defenses she had erected around her intellect. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of a profound and unsettling realization. He wasn't a villain, not in the traditional sense. He was an architect of perception, a master manipulator of information. He wasn't driven by malice, but by a detached, almost clinical curiosity. "You're a collector," she whispered, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "You collect anomalies. Minds. You build them up, analyze them, and then discard them." "Not discard," Kaelen corrected, his voice soft, almost melancholic. "I refine. I help them achieve their full potential. I showed you the prison you had built, Elara. Now I offer you the key." He extended his hand again, the holographic projection momentarily dissolving, revealing only his own calm, watchful face. "The formula isn't simply about a cure. It's about unlocking potential. It's about understanding that true redemption isn't found in erasing the past, but in confronting it, in accepting the limitations of our knowledge and striving, nonetheless, for a better future." He turned his gaze to the rain-streaked windows, a subtle sadness flickering in his eyes. "I came here, to this crumbling corporate shell, seeking a moment of peace. I found something far more complex, far more dangerous, and ultimately far more illuminating." The sound of the rain intensified, a relentless torrent of questions unanswered, of realities shattered. Elara felt a growing certainty she wasn't just a subject in his experiment. She was a mirror, reflecting back the terrifying brilliance of a mind that saw the world and herself with unnerving precision. Chapter 15. Echoes in the rain. The rain hadn't let up. It hammered against the reinforced glass of Titan Corp rooftop observation deck, a constant, insistent rhythm that mirrored the unsettling cadence of thoughts swirling within Elara. She hadn't slept. Not properly. Since Kaelen had revealed his truth, a torrent of questions, once tantalizingly abstract, now crashed against the shores of her understanding with brutal force. The fragments of her research, the formula, the ambition, the vulnerability felt suddenly exposed, dissected under the cold, analytical gaze of a man who seemed to exist outside the constraints of human morality. Kaelen stood beside her, a silhouette against the gray deluge, the expensive, impeccably tailored suit somehow radiating an aura of profound weariness. He hadn't spoken for almost an hour, simply watching the rain sculpt itself against the city's distant skyline. It was a silence heavier than any argument, a shared acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred within the small, contained space. "You said you collect anomalies," she finally murmured, the words tasting of bitter irony. "Minds. You build them up, analyze them, and then discard them." "Not discard," Kaelen corrected, his voice soft, almost melancholic. "I refine. I help them achieve their full potential. I showed you the prison you had built, Elara. Now, I offer you the key." He extended his hand again, the holographic projection momentarily dissolving, revealing only his own calm, watchful face. "The formula isn't simply about a cure. It's about unlocking potential. It's about understanding that true redemption isn't found in erasing the past, but in confronting it, in accepting the limitations of our knowledge, and striving, nonetheless, for a better future." He turned his gaze to the rain-streaked windows, a subtle sadness flickering in his eyes. "I came here, to this crumbling corporate shell, seeking a moment of peace. I found something far more complex, far more dangerous, and ultimately, far more illuminating." The sound of the rain intensified, a relentless torrent of questions unanswered, of realities shattered. Elara felt a growing certainty she wasn't just a subject in his experiment. She was a mirror, reflecting back the terrifying brilliance of a mind that saw the world, and herself, with unnerving precision. "Why me, Kaelen?" she asked, the question raw, laced with a fear she couldn't quite articulate. "Why did you choose to observe me? The formula itself is brilliant, undeniably so. But it's a confluence of factors, years of dedicated research, a particular resonance with the neurological pathways involved that makes it truly groundbreaking." He didn't immediately answer. He simply tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Your ambition, Elara, was a particularly interesting anomaly. You were driven by a need for validation, a desperate yearning to prove yourself worthy of recognition. A primal instinct, amplified by the constraints of your career, of your circumstances. And you sought to correct that?" "Not correct," he replied, his voice losing none of its quiet authority. "To understand. To witness the catalyst. I've observed countless individuals driven by similar impulses. Most succumb to the allure, consumed by the ego. A few discover a higher purpose." He gestured towards the rain. "The rain doesn't wash away the past, Elara. It reveals its contours, its hidden depths. I simply offered you a clearer view." A strange coldness began to creep into her bones. The clinical detachment Head initially presented felt less like a conscious choice and more like a fundamental operating principle. He wasn't malicious, she realized. But neither was he benevolent. He was an observer, a collector, a scholar of human fallibility. He treated her not as a person, but as a particularly complex variable in a grand, intricate equation. "You mentioned the sovereign," she said, the word catching in her throat. "The name evokes a sense of ancient power, of unimaginable skill. It's almost mythical." Kaelen allowed a ghost of a smile to touch his lips. "Legends often have a kernel of truth, Elara. The sovereign is simply a designation, a reflection of the level of mastery required to utilize the strike. It's a technique that has been refined over centuries, passed down through generations, shrouded in secrecy. It's not about brute force, but about precision, control, and a deep understanding of the human body's vulnerabilities." He paused, then added, with a disturbing note of casualness, "Many believe it's a myth. I assure you, it isn't." The silence returned, heavier now, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Elara realized she was looking at a man who had lived 1,000 lives, experienced 1,000 tragedies, and possessed a knowledge that dwarfed her own. She was a single, insignificant cell within his vast, complex organism. Suddenly, she noticed a subtle shift in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. His eyes, the color of polished steel, scanned the perimeter of the rooftop, not with concern, but with a calculating awareness. "You shouldn't be here, Elara," he said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "Not now." And in that simple statement, she understood. He hadn't sought her peace. He had sought something far more profound and far more dangerous, a deeper understanding of the shadows that clung to him, shadows that she suspected were far more than she could ever comprehend.